Hello, friends. I am Dr.LLM.Christian Barrientos Ichaso. I am international company and business lawyer. Thank you for subscribing to our YouTube channel and sharing everything about international law, security, compliance, anti-corruption, anti-crime, and all trade matters. Thank you. Thank you. Martin Arostegui is the renowned and highly experienced journalist, specialist in military and intelligence matters, who has covered the king of international conflicts. We are now seeing him deploying in Ukraine. He has worked for Voice of America, Wall Street Journal, the Daily Telegraph, the Washington Times, CNN, Fox News, and United Press International, and France 24. And is author of a book about a military special operation called Twilight Warriors. Our podcast today, Saturday, we have a law international issues. Thank you, dear Martin Arostegui. Thank you. And
hi, Christian. Good to see you. Glad to be on board. I hope there's a bit of a problem with the sound. I hope it's okay. Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I hear you very well.
Okay, fine. Because you're breaking up there a little bit, but if you can hear me, that's for the moment, that's fine. Okay, listen. I think we should begin. I think about talking about the latest developments in Ukraine. Of course, what has come to the forefront this week, as Russian troops withdraw from the area they were occupying around Kiev and has been retaken by Ukrainian forces, is the evidence of these massive atrocities that the Russians are committing against the Ukrainian civilian population, which are really, obscene proportions and levels that, frankly, the world hasn't seen in a very long time. Not this level. In fact, the casualty figures that have been given for civilians killed in Ukraine have still to be published. I mean, we don't know. We don't know. So far, the numbers given are in the thousands, but it all seems to indicate, I mean, it is much, much higher. I mean, I think when all is told and the real figures are revealed, we're going to talk about at least tens of thousands of people that have been massacred in the most horrendous way by Russian troops, by fleeing Russian troops. We don't know if this was deliberate or if it was the panic reaction of troops, and they were in a state of whose morale and the discipline were in a state of decay as their units and positions began falling apart in the face of the degree of Ukrainian resistance they didn't foresee, and that the retreat from around Kiev has been a real rout. That discipline has broken down, officers have lost control of their troops, and this is the result: massive looting, mass raping, mass killings, mass executions, often revenge, I suppose, for towns because they resisted them, that kind of thing. It's we don't know if this is deliberate. I think there may well be a degree of deliberate planning involved. We know that certain fighters have been deployed in the Ukraine, like the Chechen units, special Chechen units, which are renowned for their brutality, and we know that they were operating around Kiev. And of course, we're seeing the evidence of these mass killings around Kiev. We have yet to see what is going on in Eastern Ukraine, around Mariupol. It must be much, much worse. But no reporters are in there, no cameras are in there, no photographers are in there, no international observers are in there. So it's difficult to gauge the extent of the atrocities being committed in Eastern Ukraine, Eastern and Southern Ukraine, where we know that the Russian offensive has been brutal, absolutely brutal. Now, what this does, I mean, I think it obviously makes it more difficult to arrive at any kind of negotiated solution. It is going to be difficult for Zelensky to agree to any compromise or any agreement with an invading power that is behaving in this way. Even though this may ultimately be necessary, because Russia, of course, can threaten Ukraine with far worse atrocity than the use of weapons of mass destruction. And also, it it elevates the culpability of Vladimir Putin and his deputies, his ministers, his generals, to war criminals. I mean, it's we're already talking about a war crime prosecutions in world courts. Russia was expelled from the UN Human Rights Council this week, and it basically really relegates Russia to the level of an outlaw. Again, it's difficult to see how a serious negotiation can be reached and brokered at an international level with an outlaw regime, which is behaving in the way that the Nazis may have behaved in World War II, or that some of the worst human rights violators in the world behave today, Myanmar, that kind of thing. They were talking about genocide. The scale of atrocity we're seeing in Ukraine really can be defined and is being defined as virtual genocide. An entire people being exterminated because of the nationalistic and political beliefs. So this is the situation, which obviously is complicating the situation in Ukraine a great deal. However, I mean, what this means for Russia's battlefield situation, however, is unclear. I mean, we know that the Russian troops have now been withdrawn from northern Ukraine into Belarus, supposedly for deployment into eastern Ukraine. Although, frankly, I think from all accounts about the state of those troops, it's difficult to see how they can be, how they're in any state to be deployed anywhere. I mean, you're talking about entire units that are totally broken down. Now that he concentrates on eastern Ukraine, which again, as I said before, is a make or break for Putin, he's got to gain control of eastern Ukraine, and this whole operation has been for nothing. In fact, some analysts, we had the recent head of the CIA, former head of the CIA for Russian operations, who said on CNN that he thinks that even if he takes eastern Ukraine, even if he does not take the rest of Ukraine, or at least can assume political control over the rest of Ukraine, it is an outcome that Putin cannot accept either. So it is difficult to see how this war can come to an end at any time soon. And we have yet, as Russia doubles down in its efforts to in Mariupol, around the southern Ukrainian southern coast and the Black Sea, and in the Donbass region, the provinces of Luhansk and Donetsk. We have yet to see what the next stage is, although it's difficult to imagine that it is going to de-escalate in any way. If anything, is going to escalate because Ukraine is getting also massive infusions as a result of the evidence of the Russian atrocities of Western aid. The UK has just pledged anti-ship missiles, with which it can destroy ships that are attempting to block Odessa, possibly block troop landings. And I think today there was a meeting between Zelensky and British Prime Minister Johnson, as well as leaders of the EU, in which it was decided that, which was announced that Ukraine will be receiving $10 billion in aid, both to support its population and to buy military equipment. So Ukraine's position is also becoming increasingly strong, and it's increasingly might be able to counter the Russians. They're talking about anti-ship missiles, complex and air defense systems, long range. They're talking about, as well as the small stuff, shoulder-fired anti-aircraft systems, man pads, And of course, the anti-tank weapons, the javelins, and the British variety, already proved extremely effective. They're going to get long-range artillery, anti-ship missiles, far more complex and weapons that could be considered more offensive, to perhaps even dislodge Russia from some of its positions. So we're looking at an escalating crisis today. It's very unlikely that any kind of negotiated solution can be arrived at this point. It's become less likely, could have been. In fact, it was interesting to see Kremlin spokesman Peskov made an announcement, I think a couple of days ago, that either a negotiated solution had to be arrived at, or Russia would have to possibly agree to certain limitations as far as its campaign in Ukraine is concerned. It was conceding the idea that it can gain more territory than it already occupies. It's all in the eastern part of the country, eastern part of Ukraine. So, but you know, watching Peskov's body language was extraordinarily revealing. I mean, a man that seemed very self-confident and very assertive just a few weeks ago, today had the demeanor of a rather defeated man. I mean, the fact that he would even say the fact that that Russia may have to concede certain limitations to the extent of its operations in Ukraine was in itself an incredible admission to make to the Western media. This was for, of course, external consumption, not for internal consumption. I don't think this was played in the Russian media. The fact that he would admit to serious Russian losses so far in the military campaign is also a very important admission. And it's indicative of the fact that Russia seems the West to want to know that it's hurting, and that it wants to arrive, maybe very desperately, at a negotiated settlement that would in some way accommodate its territorial gains or its territorial holdings in Ukraine, which is what it's primarily demanding right now is Zelensky. And it's going to be, of course, with the revelations of the atrocities that have been committed, it becomes very difficult for Zelensky to agree to any concessions to Russia, and for the West to pressure him to do so, Europe or the US, which I think was a factor before. I think that becomes more and more difficult now.
May 9th commemorates Russia's victory in World War II. Called this short-term history more little action against Ukraine.
Sorry, Christian, could you repeat that? I didn't quite understand.
May 9th commemorates Russia's victory in World War II. Called this short-term history more little action against Ukraine. You think so?
Well, I think they're going to try to do something. It's going to be rather embarrassing to celebrate Russia's victory in World War II and have while facing defeat in Ukraine. They may take some offensive, or at least maybe perhaps use it to declare a certain part of eastern Ukraine as, quote unquote, liberated by Russia, as the great armies liberated Berlin and parts of Europe that they occupied following World War II. I think that we're going to see that. We're going to see some kind of propaganda offensive, accompanied, obviously movements in the field as well. Something they're going to try to do. Maybe a move on Odessa, perhaps. Although, again, I really don't think that the Russian army right now is in any state to conduct any major new venture. It's difficult to see. But I mean, you've got these troop ships coming from Siberia, all across down the Pacific, across the Indian Ocean, I guess up the Suez Canal to the Mediterranean, to the Black Sea. supposedly to be poised off Odessa, perhaps, as a landing force. Frankly, I don't know what state these troops are going to be in by the time they get there. I mean, if they're being fed, 70-year-old rations and coupled with seasickness, I'm not sure they're going to be in any fighting shape. I mean, I wonder if the reason for bringing them all around the world instead of across country, across Russia, was to keep them isolated from the information or any kind of adverse civilian reactions to the invasion, and to keep them isolated and incommunicated so they can tell them whatever they want to tell them by the time they reach Odessa. But it's possible there may be some kind of effort to land, for a landing, or some dramatic amphibious landing or something like that, to commemorate Russia's triumph over Nazi Germany. Yeah, definitely, obviously, they probably will try to do something. But I think, frankly, Christian, was emerging this week, while Russia is seriously losing militarily. In fact, it's the opposite of what many people thought was going to happen. They thought that Russia would militarily succeed in taking over Ukraine, but their economy would be so destroyed damaged by the international sanctions that it would make the victory not worth it. Something rather opposite is taking place. They're being defeated militarily, but the sanctions don't seem to be having much effect, at least not for the moment. While they've been very punishing to the oligarchs and maybe some of the ruling elite in Moscow, and to some extent the Russian people, although the effects have not yet been felt in any very serious way. I mean, there are scarcities and some foodstuffs and things, but it hasn't really impacted the population that much yet, at least not to my knowledge. I mean, I may be wrong on this, but that does not seem to be the case. The ruble is stabilizing. It is back on the foreign exchange. It is back up to levels not too far from to the dollar. That level is not too far from where it was prior to, at the time, or prior to the invasion, or prior to the sanctions that were imposed on the Russian currency. And in fact, Russians are now even being allowed to take foreign exchange out of Russia. That they're being allowed to cash in on euro and dollar deposits in Russia, which have been frozen, and even transfer them out of the country. So Russia's finances and its the ruble are recovering, and the sanctions don't seem to be having that much an effect. And in fact, what is very worrying is that, in fact, the effects could, long term, could affect the dollar a lot more than the ruble or other currency. We have recently had a series of bankers, hedge fund managers, academics, economists, talking about the warning that the dollar is in serious trouble. That the dollar is caught up in a perfect storm, as I think the way one expert defined it, due to the war in Ukraine, the rising inflation, of course, and other factors, and the tightening of monetary policy in all of G7, in the United States and G7 countries, which is raising interest rates and making it more difficult, less attractive to borrow dollars. So, but I would, I would put it in rather more simple terms. I think that the dollar is being eroded on both sides. The bridge is being taken from both ends. On the one hand, you have the effects of the domestic economic situation in the United States, in which the deficit is now rising to record levels. It's close to now $30 trillion. It is now, it's now that's a considerable portion of the entire value of the U.S. economy. And the trade deficit is also increasing, the annual trade deficit, because of the necessity to import more energy, oil and gas, due to the Biden administration's policies of restricting the ability to drill for oil, produce oil and gas from American domestic reserves. This has caused an increase in the importation of fuel, and which is adding to an already high trade deficit. So the Biden administration, the policies of the current administration in Washington is undermining, eroding the power of the dollar. And on the other hand, you have the fact that a lot of Russia and other countries are taking measures to protect themselves against the increasing weaponization of the dollar as a reserve currency, to enforce economic sanctions to further American policy, US, in this case, US and European policy objectives. You have a situation in which Russia and China are now discussing ways of conducting trade between them in yuan and rubles, leaving out the dollar. Commodity-based exchanges based on, in which they would peg their currencies to the value of gold and other commodities that they trade, and which of course are in very high supply in Russia. Russia has some of the highest energy and mineral reserves in the world. India, another economic giant, potential economic giant, is taking similar steps. They're also in the process of reaching agreements with Russia to trade for Russian oil and other minerals that India needs, aluminum, which are another mineral which are in very short supply in India right now. Trading that in the trade between rubles and the Indian currency, the rupee. So that again, I mean, you have another major economy that's joining in an effort to skirt the dollar in their to be able to conduct national trade for commodities and fuel that they need from Russia. And you have Saudi Arabia saying that they may be selling oil, eventual US sanctions that are being threatened on China, as well as possibly the latent possibility that some sanctions can be leveled on Saudi Arabia due to its deteriorating human rights record. And the refusal, for example, to prosecute those responsible for the murder of a prominent Saudi dissident and American journalist, Khashoggi, was brutally killed at the Saudi consulate or embassy in Turkey. So we have the fact that the dollar is eroding due to U.S. economic conditions, while at the same time it's being attacked by its rival powers in order so they can conduct trade between each other, is something very serious to the dollar. In fact, J.P. Morgan chairman Jamie Dimon warned some weeks ago that taking the Russia off the SWIFT system and restricting its and leaving it out of the dollar exchange would ultimately threaten the U.S. dollar, because he warned that it would lead to devising of ways to get out of the dollar to conduct certain trade and transactions on the part of Russia and other countries. Basically, you have a situation, Christian. I mean, the dollar, U.S. sanctions were fine and difficult to resist or work against while they were being applied against relatively minuscule economies. Venezuela, Cuba, Zimbabwe, even Iran. But when you're dealing with when you're dealing with a major economy like Russia, that's being assisted and protected by the second largest economy in the world, is China.
China, yes, it's true.
And such massive emerging markets like India. Then I think you're getting into totally new territory. And that the application of US sanctions may not only not be feasible in these situations, but it may actually be counterproductive. Because if these countries stop trading in dollars, it will also undermine the value of the US dollar as a world reserve currency. Mind you, I mean, you got to keep this in perspective. What the Russians, the Chinese, and India, and possibly Saudi Arabia are doing, you're talking about a relatively small volume of world trade that's involved here. But obviously, if this works, if they manage to do this, if Russia and China manage to trade, if China can buy its oil in yuan, if India can secure the commodities and fuel it needs without the dollar, it obviously undermines and it further erodes and undermines the value of the dollar as a world currency, and other countries will follow suit.
It's possible the Russia create a new crypto money for change the ruble. You use the gold for expel this new money, a crypto money, Russia crypto money.
Well, it's being talked about. Again, we don't know whether this will work. So far, of course, the Russians have been successful in their efforts to
similar in Venezuela, petrol,
prop up the ruble. And yeah, they got some kind of gold-based or commodity-based cryptocurrency, which would be accepted by China, in the satellites, Venezuela, which small economy, but also a major producer, Iran, for example. Yeah, you could possibly have a rival international trading vehicle system or tool that could possibly challenge the dollar. It's funny, you're sort of going back now to what things were before 1970. When Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard. Because until the 1970s, the dollar was indexed to the gold standard. And Nixon took it off the gold standard and made the dollar entirely subject to the policies and state of the U.S. Federal Reserve. It in effect didn't hook the dollar from any intrinsic value, the dollar dependent on the volume of economic activity conducted in the currency rather than to any objective value, gold or commodity. This, in effect, sort of goes back in a way to the gold standard that Russia has suggested, and it's something which, of course, a lot of alternative-minded economists have been suggesting for quite some time. Not that they expected Russia would do it, not that they expected it would come out in this way. I mean, they have a lot of people in the U.S. which have been advocated going back to the gold standard now for a very long time on the conservative side of the political spectrum. And it's ironic that this is actually now being seriously contemplated by rivals of the United States as a way of getting off the dollar system. So it's an interesting development. Of course, we still have there's still a long way to go. I don't think this can happen from one day to the next. But in trend in this direction does seem to be developing.
It's very interesting. New scenario in this disorder, in the economic disorder with the Russia and China, no? What do you think about the next step for China? We need to see China, because it's the support of Russia. All in this world support China and Russia's connection with the economic. Why you thinking this week going with China in supporting this aggression on the Occident and Ukraine?
Well, China's being very supportive. I mean, it certainly hasn't voted against Russia in the United Nations. It hasn't criticized Russia openly in any way. It's giving Russia undoubtedly economic support, making it feasible for Russia to trade outside the dollar system. It's undoubtedly buying rubles and finding ways to skirt sanctions to acquire the fuel, energy, and Russian commodities that it needs. I think it has stopped at giving Russia so far any military support. I mean, there are no indications at all that China is providing any significant military assistance. It may be providing assistance in maybe small ways. For example, I believe I've heard that it's replacing tires for vehicles that. China, the Russians are buying Chinese tires, and a lot of them were punctured not only by Ukrainian snipers, but also I think because they're pretty bad rubber. I don't know if you ever bought a Chinese hiking boot, but it doesn't last very long. So I think they're replacing the tires, all the Chinese tires that went flat on the road to Kiev. It's possibly rations, food to supply the starving Russian troops, which don't have anything to eat, and apparently they don't or have inadequate food supplies. Maybe the Chinese producing Chinese food is better than anything the Russians make for the K rations. Stuff like that. Maybe ammunition. Russia and China use the same caliber ammunition for small arms. So at that level, I think probably they may be assisting Russia, but I don't think they're resupplying Russia with missiles or any weapon systems or artillery or anything like that. Let alone troops on the ground. I don't think that'll ever happen. So yes, I think they're giving Russia some aid, although some direct material aid, but I think what they're giving is very good.
Yeah, because China export all goods and service from Europe and United States. The principal economy for China is the Europe and United States and Latin America, and move this for only support Russia is difficult for China. I think so, very difficult.
So that situation, I mean, it's Putin is caught up he's caught up in a very, I think, as I said before, I mean, I think he was misinformed, or possibly he deluded himself, maybe a combination of the two things. I think Putin had already deluded himself into believing that the recapture of Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, or the takeover of Ukraine would be a relatively simple thing to do. And we don't know if his intelligence services made him believe this or reinforced his belief in this because they were incompetent, which is a possibility. Although it's too hard to believe that because they had a lot of people on the ground in Ukraine, so that they would have been this misinformed is difficult to believe. Or because they're headed by yes men that wanted to give Putin what he wanted to hear, and were afraid of giving him information or reports that would displease him. I think that's more likely. I really do. And he's now caught up in a situation that he's going to find it very difficult to get out of. And the tendency is going to be to double down, while at the same time maybe having to not agree, but I think just simply adjust to a situation on the ground is going to force him to make concessions if he wants to get out of this, or just agree to, or try to put a good face on a possible defeat. He has said that we've been told that the Russians cannot fight much past May. I don't know about that. I mean, it's amazing what an army can do, especially when you're bringing people from Syria and Chechens, people that sort of have proven themselves able to fight internally in very difficult conditions, and you can sort of continue there a blood feud in the eastern Ukrainian area for a very, very long time. Sort of low intensity killings and conflicts and fighting maybe at a lesser scale than we've seen now, if he doesn't escalate further. With possible use of weapons necessary. He will either have to accept fighting in eastern Ukraine and limiting his operations to eastern Ukraine in a rather more limited scale, or escalating to the use of weapons of mass destruction and far larger weapons to intimidate and ultimately to try to break the Ukrainian government's willingness and capacity to resist. I think it'll tend to be the latter. I think he'll limit himself to a lower scale type war to consolidate his control of the eastern part of Ukraine. And he probably will be able to do this, maybe continue to, because, as I say, the sanctions haven't bitten into the economy that much. And unless the army becomes completely demoralized and ultimately turns against him, because they cannot withstand the pressures of fighting in a totally hostile environment indefinitely, this could drag on forever. And I think the way it could conceivably end is if the army rebels against him. If the army turns, at least the army in Ukraine, turns against him. And there are already signs of that. I mean, there are signs, for example, a lot of captured Russian soldiers are deserting. Russian soldiers have joined the Ukrainian side. Again, these are probably small numbers right now. But there is this, I think there is now an operation to organize deserting Russian soldiers or captured Russian soldiers prepared to go to fight on the Ukrainian side into an organized Russian force against Putin, maybe a movement within the army against Putin. This is how the regime might end. But we're still a long way.
Thank you. For conclusion, dear Martin, for conclusion, very interesting your analysis, your point. Thank you for subscribing. Thank you all. You were more a conclusion, or that is all?
Well, that's it. I mean, I think if, of course, as I said before about the dollar, if this indeed does end up in the next few months or maybe years in the fall of Putin, if this war in the Ukraine drags out, and his army proves incapable of conducting it, or it turns the army against him, yeah, then I think if we would see that the power of the dollar, even though the sanctions themselves were the power of the United States and that of NATO and East European allies would be asserted. And I think at that point, probably an erosion of the dollar and Western currencies would be averted. But still, I mean, the fact that you've got major economies and major commodity producers now thinking in terms of skirting the dollar is a very disturbing byproduct of this war.
Very interesting economy analysis with Martin Arostegui. Thank you for subscribing. Thank you for sharing this video and following this YouTube international law. Thank you, Martin Arostegui.
Thank you, Christian. See you for the 20th. See you for our 20th podcast. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye. See you next Saturday.
See you next Saturday.